Stanisław II August was the last king and Grand Duke of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He remains a controversial figure in Polish history, recognized as a great patron of the arts and sciences and an initiator and firm supporter of progressive reforms. He is also remembered as the last king of the Commonwealth whose election was marred by Russian involvement. He is criticized primarily for his failure to stand against the partitions, and thus to prevent the destruction of Poland. Arriving at the Russian imperial court in St. Petersburg in 1755, he became romantically involved with the 26-year-old Catherine Alexievna, 3 years his senior. With her support, in 1764 he was elected King of Poland. Against expectations, he attempted to reform and strengthen the ailing Commonwealth. His efforts met with external opposition from Prussia, Russia and Austria, all interested in keeping the Commonwealth weak, and from internal conservative interests, which saw reforms as threatening the traditional liberties and prerogatives. The defining crisis of his early reign, the War of the Bar Confederation, led to the first partition of Poland. The latter part of his reign saw reforms wrought by the Great Sejm and the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791. These reforms were overthrown by the 1792 Targowica Confederation and by the war in defense of the Constitution, leading directly to the Second Partition of Poland, the Kosciuszko Uprising and the final Third Partition of Poland, marking the end of the Commonwealth. Stripped of all meaningful power, Poniatowski abdicated in November 1795 and spent the last years of his life in semi-captivity in St. Petersburg. A Polish noble of the Siolek coat of arms and a member of the Poniatowski family, he was the son of Count Stanisław Poniatowski, Castellan of Kraków, and Princess Konstancja Czartoryska, brother of Michał Jerzy Poniatowski, Primate of Poland, and uncle to Prince Joseph Poniatowski. Royal titles. The English translation of the Polish text of the 1791 Constitution gives his title as Stanisław August, by the grace of God and the will of the people, King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania and Duke of Ruthenia, Prussia, Masovia, Samogitia, Kiev, Volhynia, Podolia, Podlasie, Livonia, Smolensk, Severia and Chernihiv. Life. Youth. Stanisław August Poniatowski was born on the 17th of January 1732 in Wolchin, then located in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and now part of Belarus, to Stanisław Poniatowski and Konstancja and Czartoryska. The Poniatowski family of the Siolek coat of arms was among the highest of the Polish nobility. He spent the first few years of his childhood in Gdansk. Afterward, his family moved to Warsaw. He was educated by his mother, then by private tutors, including Russian ambassador Hermann Karl von Kieseling. He did not have many friends in his teenage years. Instead, he developed a fondness for books, which continued throughout his life. He made his first foreign voyage in 1748, when he accompanied the Russian army as it advanced to Germany. During the trip he visited Aachen and the Netherlands. Later that year he returned to the Commonwealth, stopping in Dresden. Political career. Poniatowski spent the following year as an apprentice in the chancellery of Michał Frederick Czartoryski, then the deputy chancellor of Lithuania. In 1750, he travelled to Berlin. There he met the British diplomat Charles Hanbury Williams, who became his mentor and friend. In 1751, Poniatowski was elected to the Treasury Tribunal in Radek, where he served as a commissioner the following year. He spent most of January 1752 at the Austrian court in Vienna. Later that year, after serving at a Radom tribunal and meeting with King Augustus III of Poland, he was a Sejm deputy. During that same his father acquired for him the title of Starost of Przemysl. In March 1753 he left on another foreign trip, this time through Hungary to Vienna, where he met Williams again. He spent more time in the Netherlands, where he met many key members of that country's political and economical sphere. By late August he arrived in Paris, where he again entered the high social circles. In February 1754 he left Paris and travelled to England, where he spent the next few months. There he befriended Charles Yorke, future Lord Chancellor of Great Britain. He returned to the Commonwealth later that year, this time not participating in the same, as his parents wanted to keep him out of the political drama surrounding the Ostrogski family's fete. Next year he received a title of Stolnik of Lithuania. Ultimately, Poniatowski owed his career to his family connections with the powerful Czartoryski family and a political faction known as Familia, to whom he grew closer. It was the Familia who sent him in 1755 to St. Petersburg in the service of Williams, who had been named British ambassador to Russia. In St. Petersburg, Poniatowski met the 26-year-old Catherine Alexievna. The two became lovers. Whatever his feelings for Catherine, it is likely Poniatowski also saw an opportunity to use the relationship for his own benefit, using her influence to bolster his career. Poniatowski had to leave St. Petersburg in July 1756 due to court intrigue. Through the combined influence of Catherine, Russian Empress Elizabeth and Chancellor Bestuzhev Ryumin, Poniatowski rejoined the Russian court as ambassador of Saxony the following January. In St. Petersburg, he became the source of more intrigue between various European governments, some supporting his appointment, others demanding his withdrawal. Eventually, he left the Russian capital on the 14th of August 1758. Poniatowski attended the SEJMs of 1758, 1760 and 1762. He continued his involvement with the Familia, and supported a pro-Russian and anti-Prussian stance in Polish politics. His father died in 1762, leaving him a moderate inheritance. In 1762, when Catherine ascended to the Russian throne, she sent him several letters professing her support for his ascension to the Polish throne, but asking him to stay away from St. Petersburg. Nevertheless, Poniatowski hoped that Catherine would consider marriage, an idea that was seen as plausible by some international observers. He was involved with the unrealized plans of the Familia for a coup d'état against Augustus III. In August 1763, however, Catherine advised him and the Familia that she would not support a coup as long as Augustus III were alive. Years of hope. Upon the death of Poland's King Augustus III in October 1763, negotiations began concerning the election of the new king. Catherine threw her support behind Poniatowski. The Russians spent about 2.5 rubles supporting his election. Poniatowski's supporters and opponents engaged in some military posturing and even minor clashes, and in the end, the Russian army was deployed only a few miles from the election same, which met at Wola near Warsaw. In the end, there were no other serious contenders, and during the convocation same on the 7th of September 1764, the 32-year-old Poniatowski was elected king, with 5,584 votes. He swore the Pacta Conventa on the 13th of November, and the formal coronation took place in Warsaw on the 25th of November. The new king's uncles in the Familia would have preferred another nephew on the throne, Prince Adam Kazimierz Czartoryski, characterized by one of his contemporaries as debauché, sin and dévoyé, but Czartoryski had declined to seek the office. Stanisław August, as he now styled himself, combining the names of his two immediate royal predecessors, began his rule with rough support within the nation. Particularly, the lower nobility was favorable towards him. In his first years, he attempted to introduce a number of reforms. He founded the Knights' School, and began to form a diplomatic service, with semi-permanent diplomatic representatives throughout Europe, Russia and the Ottoman Empire. On the 7th of May 1765, Poniatowski established the Order of the Knights of St. Stanislaus, Bishop and Martyr, in honor of Poland's and his own patron saint, as Poland's second order of chivalry, to reward Poles for noteworthy service to the king. Together with the Familia, he tried to reform the ineffective government, reducing the powers of the hetmans and treasurers, moving them to commissions elected by the same and responsible to the king. In his memoirs, Poniatowski called this period the Years of Hope. The Familia, which was interested in strengthening the power of their own faction, was dissatisfied with his conciliatory policy as he reached out to many former opponents of the policies. This uneasy alliance between Poniatowski and the Familia continued for most of the first decade of his rule. One of the points of contention between Poniatowski and the Familia concerned the rights of the religious minorities in Poland, whereas Poniatowski reluctantly supported a policy of religious tolerance. The Familia was opposed to it. The growing rift between Poniatowski and the Familia was exploited by the Russians, who used this issue as a pretext to intervene in the Commonwealth's internal politics and destabilize the country. Catherine had no desire to see Poniatowski's reform succeed. She had supported his ascent to the throne to ensure that the Commonwealth would remain a weak state under Russian control, and his attempts to reform the state sailing machinery were a threat to the status quo. Bar Confederation and first partition of Poland. Matters came to a head in 1766. During the same in October of that year, Poniatowski attempted to push a radical reform, restricting the disastrous liberum veto policy. He was opposed by conservatives such as Michał Wielhorski, who were supported by the Prussian and Russian ambassadors, who threatened war if the reform was passed. The dissidents, supported by the Russians, formed a confederation, the Radom Confederation, abandoned by the Familia. Poniatowski's reforms failed to pass at the Rybnen Sejm, named after Russian ambassador Nicholas Rybnen, who promised to guarantee the golden liberties of the Polish nobility, enshrined in the cardinal laws, with all the might of the Russian Empire. Although it had abandoned the cause of Poniatowski's reforms, the Familia did not receive the support it expected from the Russians, who continued to press for the dissidents' rights. Meanwhile, some factions now rallied under the banner of the Bar Confederation aimed against the dissidents, Poniatowski and the Russians. After an unsuccessful attempt to find allies in Western Europe, Poniatowski and the Familia had no choice but to rely more heavily on the Russian Empire, which treated Poland as a protectorate. In the War of the Bar Confederation, Poniatowski supported the Russian army's repression of the Bar Confederation. In 1770, the Council of the Bar Confederation proclaimed him dethroned. The following year, he was kidnapped by Bar Confederate sympathizers and briefly held prisoner outside of Warsaw, but managed to escape. Faced with the weakness of Poland and continuing chaos, Austria, Russia and Prussia decided to intervene militarily, in exchange for significant territorial concessions from the Commonwealth, a decision they made without consulting Poniatowski or other Polish parties. Although Poniatowski protested the first partition of the Commonwealth, he was powerless to do anything about it. He considered abdication, but decided against it. During the Partition Sejm of 1773 to 1775, in which Russia was represented by Ambassador Otto von Stackelberg, with no help forthcoming from abroad and the armies of the partitioning powers occupying Warsaw to compel the Sejm same by force of arms. No alternative was available save submission to the will. Eventually Poniatowski and the Sejm acceded to the Partition Treaty. At the same time, several other reforms were passed. The cardinal laws were confirmed and guaranteed by the partitioning powers. Royal power was restricted, as the king lost the power to give out titles and positions of military officers, ministers and senators. The Starostu territories and crown lands would be awarded through an auction. The Sejm also created two notable institutions: the Permanent Council, a main governmental body in continuous operation, and the Commission of National Education. The partitioners intended the council to be easier to control than the unruly SEJMs, and indeed it remained under the influence of the Russian Empire. Nevertheless, it was a significant improvement in the Commonwealth governance. The new legislation was guaranteed by the Russian Empire, giving it another excuse to interfere in Commonwealth politics if the legislation it favored was changed. The political scene in the aftermath of the partition Sejm saw the rise of a conservative faction which was opposed to the Permanent Council, seeing it as a threat to the Golden Freedoms. This faction was supported by the Czartoryski family, but not by Poniatowski, who proved to be quite adept at making the council follow his wishes. This marked the formation of new anti-royal and pro-royal factions in Polish politics. The royal faction was made up primarily of people indebted to the king, who planned to build their careers on service to him. Few were privy to his plans for reforms, which were kept hidden from the conservative opposition and Russia. Poniatowski scored a political victory during the Sejm of 1776, which further strengthened the council. Chancellor Andrzej Zamoyski was tasked with the codification of the Polish law, a project that became known as the Zamoyski Code. Russia supported some, but not all, of the 1776 reforms, and to prevent Poniatowski from growing too powerful, it supported the opposition during the Sejm of 1778. This marked the end of Poniatowski's reforms, as he found himself without sufficient support to carry them through. In the 1780s, Catherine slightly favored Poniatowski over the opposition, but did not support any of his plans for significant reforms. Despite repeated attempts, Poniatowski failed to confederate the SEJMs, which would have made them immune to liberum veto. Thus, although he had a majority in the SEJMs, Poniatowski was unable to pass even the smallest reform. The Zamoyski Code was rejected by the Sejm of 1780, and opposition attacks on the king dominated the SEJMs of 1782 and 1786. Reforms became possible again in the late 1780s, in the context of the wars being waged against the Ottoman Empire by both the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire. Poniatowski tried to draw Poland into the Austro-Russian alliance, seeing a war with the Ottomans as an opportunity to strengthen the Commonwealth. Catherine gave permission for the next Sejm to be confederated, as she considered some form of limited military alliance with Poland against the Ottomans might be useful. The Polish-Russian alliance was not implemented, as in the end the only acceptable compromise proved unattractive to both sides. However, in the ensuing four-year Sejm of 1788–92, Poniatowski threw his lot with the reformers associated with the Patriotic Party of Stanisław Malachowski, Ignacy Potocki and Hugo Kołłątaj, and co-authored the Constitution of 3 May 1791. The Constitution introduced sweeping reforms. According to Jacek Jedrzuk, the Constitution, in the liberality of its provisions, fell somewhere below the French, above the Canadian, and left the Prussian far behind, but was no match for the American Constitution. George Sanford notes that the Constitution gave Poland a constitutional monarchy close to the English model of the time. Poniatowski himself described it, according to a contemporary account, as founded principally on those of England and the United States of America, but avoiding the faults and errors of both, and adapted as much as possible to the local and particular circumstances of the country. The Constitution of the 3rd of May remained to the end a work in progress. A new civil and criminal code was in the works. Poniatowski also planned a reform improving the situation of the Polish Jews. In foreign policy, spurned by Russia, Poland turned to another potential ally, the Triple Alliance, represented on the Polish diplomatic scene primarily by the Kingdom of Prussia, which led to the formation of the ultimately futile Polish-Prussian alliance. The pro-Prussian shift was not supported by Poniatowski, who nevertheless acceded to the decision of the majority of Sejm deputies. The passing of the Constitution of the 3rd of May, although officially applauded by Frederick William II of Prussia, who sent a congratulatory note to Warsaw, caused further worry in Prussia. The contacts of Polish reformers with the revolutionary French National Assembly were seen by Poland's neighbors as evidence of a conspiracy and a threat to their absolute monarchies. Prussian statesman Ewald von Hertzberg expressed the fears of European conservatives. The Poles have given the coup de grace to the Prussian monarchy by voting a constitution, elaborating that a strong Commonwealth would likely demand the return of the lands Prussia acquired in the first partition. A similar sentiment was later expressed by Prussian Foreign Minister Friedrich Wilhelm von Schulenburg-Kennet. Russia's wars with the Ottomans and Sweden having ended, Catherine was furious over the adoption of the constitution, which threatened Russian influence in Poland. One of Russia's chief foreign policy authors, Alexander Bezborodko, upon learning of the constitution, commented that the worst possible news have arrived from Warsaw. The Polish king has become almost sovereign. War in defense of the constitution, an end of the Commonwealth. Shortly thereafter, conservative Polish nobility formed the Targowica Confederation to overthrow the constitution, which they saw as a threat to the traditional freedoms and privileges they enjoyed. The Confederates aligned themselves with Russia's Catherine the Great, and the Russian army entered Poland, marking the start of the Polish-Russian War of 1792, also known as the War in Defense of the Constitution. The Sejm voted to increase the Polish army to 100,000 men, but due to insufficient time and funds this number was never achieved. Poniatowski and the reformers could field only a 37,000-man army, many of them untested recruits. This army, under the command of the king's nephew Joseph Poniatowski and Tadeusz Kosciuszko, managed to defeat the Russians and fight them to a draw on several occasions. Following the victorious Battle of Zeeland, in which Polish forces were commanded by his nephew, the king founded a new order, the Order of Virtuti Militari, to reward Poles for exceptional military leadership and courage in combat. Despite Polish requests, Prussia refused to honor its alliance obligations. In the end, the numerical superiority of the Russians was too great, and defeat looked inevitable. Poniatowski's attempts at negotiations with Russia proved futile. In July 1792, when Warsaw was threatened with siege by the Russians, the king came to believe that surrender was the only alternative to total defeat. Having received assurances from Russian ambassador Yakov Bulgakov that no territorial changes would occur, a cabinet of ministers called the Guard of Laws voted 8-4 in favor of surrender. On the 24th of July 1792, Poniatowski joined the Targowica Confederation. The Polish army disintegrated. Many reform leaders, believing the cause lost, went into self-exile, although they hoped that Poniatowski would be able to negotiate an acceptable compromise with the Russians, as he had done in the past. Poniatowski had not saved the Commonwealth, however. He and the reformers had lost much of their influence both within the country and with Catherine. Neither were the Targowica Confederates victorious. To the surprise, there ensued the second partition of Poland. With the new deputies bribed or intimidated by the Russian troops, the Grodno Sejm took place. On the 23rd of November 1793, it annulled all acts of the Great Sejm, including the Constitution. Faced with his powerlessness, Poniatowski once again considered abdication. In the meantime, he tried to salvage whatever reforms he could. Final years Poniatowski's plans were ruined by the Kosciuszko uprising. The king did not encourage it, but once it began he supported it, seeing no other honorable option. Its defeat marked the end of the Commonwealth. Poniatowski tried to govern the country in the brief period after the defeat of the uprising, but on the 2nd of December 1794, Catherine demanded that he leave Warsaw, a request to which he acceded on the 7th of January 1795, leaving the capital under Russian military escort and settling briefly in Grodno. On the 24th of October 1795, the act of the final, third partition of Poland was signed. 1 month and 1 day later, on the 25th of November, Poniatowski signed his abdication. Catherine died on the 17th of November 1796, succeeded by Paul I of Russia. On the 15th of February 1797, Poniatowski left for St. Petersburg, Russia. He hoped to be allowed to travel abroad, but was not able to secure permission to do so. A virtual prisoner in St. Petersburg's Marble Palace, he subsisted on a pension granted to him by Catherine. Despite financial troubles, he still supported some of his former allies, and he tried to represent the Polish case at the Russian court. He also worked on his memoirs. Poniatowski died after a stroke on the 12th of February 1798. Paul I sponsored a royal state funeral, and on the 3rd of March he was buried at the Catholic Church of St. Catherine in St. Petersburg. In 1938, when the Soviet Union planned to demolish the church, his remains were transferred to the Second Polish Republic, and put in a church at Wolcin, his birthplace. This was done in secret, and it caused a controversy in Poland when the issue became known. In the 1990, due to poor state of the Wolochin church, his body was transferred to Poland once more, to St. John's Cathedral in Warsaw, where, on the 3rd of May 1791, he had celebrated the adoption of the constitution he had co-authored and endorsed. A final funeral ceremony was held on the 14th of February 1995.